Hello, everyone. Welcome to VAV 29 Virtual Lunch and Learn. And today we would love to begin by acknowledging the land that we are broadcasting is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So thank you so much. And we're going to show you our sponsors logo slide. So this is a virtual moderated conversation style presentation of Canada Media Fund CMF program funding support available for mid-level creatives or producers who are advancing to develop TV series and feature-length programming. Today, please welcome our panelists, Sasha Dryden, Development Analyst of CMF, and Kristen Chiu, CMF Analyst. Welcome. And I would give the stage to Christine and Sasha for the presentation, and please save your question in the end after the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, welcome, everybody. Just a quick correction.
Hello.
I'm not a development analyst. I'm similar to Christine. We're both working on the production side of things. So we can go pretty quickly through the first couple of slides. So this is us. VAF does have a copy of this. If you wanted a copy of this that included our contact information, the entire presentation, you can request it and they'll be able to provide it to you. So Christine and I work on the Canada Media Fund program administration side of Telefilm Canada. And we'll just go through that a little bit. If you could show the next slide. We've got a brief agenda, an overview, going over some linear content programs with a little focus on children's and youth, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So for the next slide, please. Telefilm Canada is an umbrella organization that on one side funds feature film programs, and on the other, it administers the funding for broadcast destined programming. And we work in the broadcast side. So just to provide a little bit of context, which is for broadcast triggered projects, both in development and in production. And so basically what we're going to go over quite briefly is some of that production financing and some of that development financing and how that works through the CMF-PA side of the organization. And just to clarify, CMF stands for Canada Media Fund, which is a separate organization who set the policies, set the guidelines, and we execute those policies and guidelines as part of our relationship with them. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at mine as well. This slide is basically showing the amount of funding that we have to administer for this year. So a couple of overarching pieces of context here. Number one, our fiscal year runs from April the 1st through March 31st of the subsequent year. So at this stage of this calendar year, we're actually closing things down. We're towards the end of actually receiving any new applications. So everything we're talking about is largely in relation to the year that we're in the process of closing. And another piece that relates to this sort of list of funds is that the funding that the CMF gets to spend towards projects is provided through a mixture of Canadian heritage and through the broadcasters. And the broadcasters are awarded funds every year by the CMF based on a series of formulas and calculations that incorporates looking at the money that they spent the year before on CMF programming and just a series of formulas that determine how much funding there is available for any given broadcaster to spend. So this slide basically reflects in a snapshot the types of funding, the programs that we administered this year, and the types of funding and the amount of funding that was available to spend on productions. Just one additional little caveat: not all of the money that we administer, that Telefilm administers through the CMFPA, is from the broadcaster. The heritage money that we administer doesn't necessarily get spent in the same manner that the broadcaster money does. So the broadcasters are awarded envelopes and they can spend that money on projects that they decide to spend it on. The money that's not envelope related is spent on projects by the CMF, and the mechanisms of how that money gets allocated towards projects is a little bit different. That's quite detail oriented. We would always be happy to go into that in a little bit more detail, but just to sort of know, there are some of these funds that are listed on this slide aren't necessarily from the broadcaster. Some of them are sort of spent in a discrete and different way than the envelope allocation. Hopefully I'm not making that more complicated. Anyway, next slide. So this is a very brief look at how the mechanism of the envelopes work. So that formula I was talking about before talks about how the CMF awards an envelope to broadcasters, Canadian broadcasters. And each year, the broadcasters who have an envelope are given an amount, or they're told this is how much you have to spend. So that's step one. The broadcaster then has the ability to commit some of that money towards production and development projects that they want to then have apply to the CMF to access the funds. And so that's 2 to 3. And then from 3 to 4, the producer is the one who makes the application after the broadcaster has said, I'm going to give you a license or a trigger amount, and then I'm also going to let you go and spend this much money of my envelope. Then the producer, with that commitment from the broadcaster, comes to us at the CMFPA and applies. We put in an application. And through the process of that application, we then commit the funds to the project, go to contract, and start dispersing the funds towards their development or their production. And so it sort of goes around and around, because number 4 in that chart then leads back into the formula and the calculations that are applied the next year to determine which broadcasters are going to have an envelope and how much of an envelope they're going to have to spend that they can then award to projects and that they're interested in supporting for broadcast and for development. I think, next slide, please. So an overview of what this last fiscal year looked like. These are the broadcasters who had envelopes, English and French broadcasters, obviously, because we, those are the 2 main Canadian languages. These are what they had to spend on projects throughout the year. And those were communicated to them, and those were awarded to them after that formula calculation of how much they would get. So these are all the envelopes that they have to spend. But even, next slide, please, even if a broadcaster doesn't have an envelope, they've partnered with other broadcasters on a project, but they haven't yet built up enough broadcast for the CMF to award them an envelope. There is what we call an alternative access envelope that allows for a broadcaster who doesn't have their own CMF envelope to still come in and access some money. It's a different sort of mechanism, but it's similar in that they do get to spend some of this envelope money and have that go towards their development and production. And then the other broadcasters listed on this is very specifically about diverse languages. So we have a diverse language program fund for projects that are going to be produced in a 3rd language, so not English, French, or a Canadian Indigenous language, are going to be produced in any other language. And so there is a pocket of broadcasters who produce these kinds of projects, who broadcast these kinds of projects, and who work with producers who are working on third language productions. And these are those broadcasters, and this is the amount of money that they had to be able to allocate towards diverse language programming for this past fiscal year. And I think I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Christine. Next slide, please.
All right, so thanks, Sasha. I'm going to talk a bit more about our linear content programs. So in that big budget overview, we have interactive digital media program funds, and we have linear content. And the ones for film and TV producers would fall under the linear content program. And that was kind of all the envelope funding and budget that Sasha talked about as well. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about, well, the linear content, there's development and production funds. I'm going to go into a little bit more about the development, but just as an overview, so applicants must be Canadian controlled, and projects, they have to be for television. So usually there's a broadcaster license. This year we also allow distributor license, distributor advances to be part of the funding trigger, and there's a calculation for that. And in terms of genre that the CMF funds, it's basically four. So children and youth is one of them, children programs, documentary, drama, variety, and performing arts. So under the drama, what you need to know is just basically scripted. It doesn't mean like drama as a genre, but like it means like comedy as well. It could be horror. It just means scripted. And then next slide. And here is kind of all the other ineligible genres that the CMF doesn't fund. This is not a complete list. It's just the type of programs that have come in that we would not be part of. So one thing to note is like maybe a lifestyle production. Those are kind of the productions that the CMF won't fund. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the pre-development and development funding programs. So they fall under three categories, which is selective funds, first come, first serve, which we also call our incentive funds, and then an automatic program, which is the envelope allocations that Sasha mentioned. So in terms of a selective program for development, we have the Indigenous program, pre-development and development. And this is the first year that you would apply to the ISO, the Indigenous Screen Office, specifically for this program because they administer it now. And then there's also international co-development incentives that fall under the selective fund. So in terms of selective, that means that you apply by a deadline, and then all the applications that come in will take some time to go through it, and then they would be juried, or there's a internal selection committee. So that's how the projects get funded, and not every project will get funded, most likely, just because there's just aren't enough funds available. So you could be eligible, but your project might not get selected based on the criteria. And then first come, first serve programs for development. There's a Northern Incentive Development Fund that's geared toward applicants in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. There's also a Francophone Minority Fund for Francophone applicants outside Quebec, a pre-development program, English and French, and the program for Black and racialized communities, and there's a pre-development and development stream. So first come, first serve means that all the applicants that come in on opening day, if all the funds like have been kind of depleted on opening day, we would consider all the applications that came in. If there are enough, and then if there aren't enough applicants or applications that come in on opening day, then it would kind of be like a first come, first serve. Then the projects will be assigned funding based on who comes in, basically, after that. But for something like the program for Black and racialized communities, it's quite, and the pre-development program, they're quite popular. So basically you're looking at submitting your application on opening day. And any project that's eligible would receive funding, but mostly based on a prorated amount. And then the last type is the automatic program. So this program's pretty much open all year, and you would come in for funding as when your broadcaster gives you the funds, basically. Okay, so next slide. So in terms of the pre-development incentive fund, this is just a little bit more information on what you can get. You can get up to 84% of your project's eligible costs, or a maximum of $35,000. In order to apply to the pre-development program, you would need to have a letter of interest. So your broadcaster doesn't have to give you funding towards the project, but you do need to have this letter of interest. And it's competitive because each Canadian broadcaster can only give 2 letters out for the year. And there's also participating provincial and territorial funding agencies that participate in this fund as well. In terms of the Black and Racialized Community Pre-Development Fund, it's the same thing, that there's a Canadian broadcaster, Canadian broadcasters can trigger this program. But again, it's like they can only have 2 letters. They can only give 2 letters out for the year. And for Indigenous pre-development, which is administered by the ISO, there is no limit for the Canadian broadcaster or digital distributor for this program. But it is a selective fund, so just because you're eligible, it doesn't mean you'll get selected. Okay, next slide. Okay, so in terms of development funding, for the Black and Racialized Community Development Fund, you can get the lesser of 75% of eligible costs, or $100,000, to a maximum of $200,000. That means that you probably came in for a different fund before, so that's why it went up to $200,000. And each Canadian broadcaster may trigger up to 3 projects for this program, but you can only apply with 1 project for the year. And for Indigenous development, it is the same. It's up to 75% of eligible costs, or $100,000, to a maximum of $200,000 for all phases of development combined. And same thing, it's Canadian broadcaster or digital. Well, for this one, you can also have a digital distributor, and there is no limit on the number of projects the Canadian broadcaster can trigger. Next slide. Okay, so Sasha, if you want to talk a little bit more about the production funds.
Yeah, so similar to how Christine was talking about the distinction between different pockets of funding and how they're administered, just a little context as well. When I was earlier talking about the difference between the pocket of envelope funds that a broadcaster is awarded every year to spend on projects of their choosing, the Heritage Fund money that we administer is sort of represented very briefly by these 2 other pockets of money. So the selective program and the first come, first serve programs, these are generally heritage money that isn't sort of linked to a broadcaster. The broadcaster isn't telling us or telling the producer how these should be spent. It's the envelope that they're saying, we want to spend it on these projects. So the selective and the first come, first serve programs are the heritage money that we administer on behalf of the CMF. So they have different mechanisms for applying and for funding. They do still demand a broadcast trigger, and they are still part of the overall linear programs that we administer, but they have a little bit of a different application process. Just another layer of this is that they can, in some cases, some of these programs can be stacked on top of one another. If you apply for one pot, it's one pot of money, one fund, it doesn't necessarily preclude you from being able to access money from another one of these pots of funds. They can sometimes work together to help sort of boost the amount overall that you might be able to, the overall amount of money that you might be able to get from the CMF. So the selected programs, similar to development, as of this year, the Indigenous Green Office is now administering both the development and the production funding, CMF funding for that. So you would apply directly with them. We have a point of view program, which is for documentaries that are author and POV driven. This is a program where there's a deadline to apply. All of the projects that are eligible move forward and are evaluated and juried, and the decisions are made. There's a maximum amount of money that's available. Once the projects who are going to be successful have been scored and ranked, the amount of money that's available is dispersed among those projects. And anything that's sort of below a line in terms of meeting targeted points isn't going to be able to share in those funds. So it's competitive. All of that to say it's competitive. You're competing against your peers to access a small pocket of money that's been set aside for these particular types of projects, of productions. And then we also have the Program for Black and Racialized Communities. This is, again, targeted funding aimed at supporting projects being produced by Black and racialized members of the production community. So with all of these selective programs, there are criteria. There's additional sort of criteria around the ownership and the control, and in some cases around language. For instance, the Indigenous Fund does have a language component. And these are all elements that are meant to help target certain elements, certain populations, so that we can ensure that production financing gets to those individuals and that those individuals fully own and control those productions. Then we get into the other pocket of money, first come, first serve, which Christine touched on in development. This is, again, heritage money that we administer as we see fit. So these guidelines are, they're, again, not all that similar to the envelope. The funding allocation is not all that administered all that similarly. In terms of how it works, it's, again, we have an opening date for each of them, and projects that are looking to access money on that opening date have until either the end of that day or until the money runs out to access the funding. They're all popular, and they're all usually oversubscribed. So we generally recommend that people treat the opening date like a deadline date, because it's very likely for the majority of them that there won't be a second day, and we'll receive we'll receive applications on that opening date for more money than we have. We'll race through an eligibility review to determine which projects are going to be eligible, and then we divide the money amongst all the eligible projects that submitted their project on that opening date, which is generally how it works because they are oversubscribed. So similar to development, we have a Northern Incentive Program, which is for Canadian applicant companies located in Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. We have an English Regional Production Bonus, which is a bonus targeting the 9 provinces across the country for projects that are able to confirm that they're regional. So they are more than 150 kilometers. They're being produced, and the ownership of the company is established with people who are based more than 150 kilometers from, or at least 150 kilometers from Montreal or Toronto. So that's sort of a definition of regional. There are other definitions and other criteria, and we would always discuss them in depth with you if you're looking at those. Anglophone minority, this is available to Quebec applicants only who are producing in English within Quebec. And Francophone minority, Francophone applicants who are working outside of Quebec. So again, these are targeted funds meant to reach a wider spectrum of producers and production companies working in a specific area, or largely within a specific area. And then what we're calling the automatic programming is where we go back into that broadcaster envelope, where the broadcaster is spending a portion of their envelope and saying, giving some of that envelope money to a production and saying, please go and apply to the CMF to access that money. So we have English and French envelopes where broadcasters have who are broadcasting in English and French, and in some cases, broadcasters are broadcasting in both languages. Like CBC. There are other broadcasters who are dual language, APTN. So that there's an envelope that's primarily targeting English and French, and then we also again go back to that diverse language envelope program, which is for productions that are being produced in a third language that's not English, French, or Canadian and Indigenous. And again, like I said, you can stack, in some cases, you can stack these funds on top of each other in your production. There's a little bit of an order of operations. There's a little bit of sort of a bureaucracy about how you approach that. And we would always be happy to work through the mechanisms of that and talk to you about how that would work. Because we don't necessarily expect you to understand how we manage the funds as they move through the system, but we can help make that an easier process for you and, give you the guidance that you need as you're trying to navigate that. Next slide, please. So just a little bit briefly, the program for Black and racialized communities, the maximum amount of CMF funds that can be requested is either the lesser of 60% of the eligible costs or a maximum of 750,000. If it's drama, that's scripted programming, or 550,000 for other genres, the other CMF genres, so children's and youth, documentary, and variety and performing arts. And I just do want to clarify something here. We use the phrase eligible costs, and I would say for the purposes of understanding how we relate to that, I would exchange that for budget. In general, what we're referring to when we refer to eligible costs is the budget. For the reason we call it eligible costs is because upon occasion there can be costs in a budget that the CMF says, no, we won't relate to that. That's not something that we're going to support. So we're going to subtract that amount that we're not supporting from your budget, and we'll relate to everything else, and we just won't relate to that little ineligible cost. So for the purposes of making sure that we're referring to the right thing, it's called eligible costs, but you can, for the most part, treat it, interchange those words with the word budget. Your broadcaster would need to provide a license fee. This is the fee to acquire the rights to broadcast your program, of at least 10% of the eligible costs, aka budget. In this year, I think this is the first year, if not the second, we now allow for a broadcaster and an eligible Canadian distributor or foreign scheduled broadcaster to combine pockets of money to meet that 10% or exceed that 10% license fee threshold, or eligible triggering commitment thresholds that we call it. There's a grid, and the guidelines always sort of detail what the elements are in the grid and what the scores are. So the grid is scoring market interest, and that relates to the market interest from broadcaster and distributor. The team, so that's your key personnel, that's your producer, executive producer, your production team, but it also includes your creative team, so director and writer. Those individuals working on the production are scored. Narrative positioning, so giving some information about why it is that you should be telling this particular story, and that'll be scored. And then the creative elements, just to distinguish, Some of those pieces, some of those scored elements are scored by us as analysts internally, and some of those scored elements are scored by an external jury of peers. And so for all of these programs, actually the for the PBRC, for the Indigenous program, for the POV program, they all have a juried element where external jury is weighing in and awarding scores for some of the elements, some of the overall elements. For the Indigenous program, there's a similar 60% maximums of 60% or 750,000 for drama, or 550 for the other genres. There's again a 10% market threshold from the broadcaster or distributor. And there's a language element. So for the Indigenous program, at least 20% of the completed production has to be in an Indigenous language. POV program, the maximum that can be awarded from the CMF is up to 40, the lesser of 49%, or eligible costs, or sorry, a maximum of 400,000. There's a 15% license fee threshold. That's a little bit higher than Indigenous and the Black and racialized community programs. Docs can ask for up to 750,000. Feature length. Feature docs can ask for up to 400,000. Again, the eligible triggering commitment threshold can be met with a combination of broadcaster and distributor. And there's again similar criteria that are scored. Some of those scores are awarded by us, the analysts internally, and some, in particular, creative elements, are awarded by an external jury. And then the diverse language program. This is not through like a deadline program or through a juried program, but this is that other pocket of financing that's awarded to projects being produced in a third language. So the request can be up to 49%. Or eligible triggering threshold from the broadcaster needs to meet 10% of the budget. And again, that 10% can again be made up of broadcaster and distributor commitment. And it is an envelope program, meaning that there are broadcasters who have a designated envelope of funds to spend on these third language productions. It's not selective. So it's not a deadline fund, and it's not, the elements of the project aren't scored and ranked, similar to the other three programs that I talked about. So I think next slide, we'll move into children's and youth.
Yeah, we just wanted to mention that this year that the CMF is giving more support for children and youth projects because they found that broadcasters weren't giving as much funding for these projects, so they wanted to give it a little bit of a boost. So next slide, on what kind of incentives they're giving. So in terms of the distributor program, 40% of the projects funded would be children's and youth. Same thing in these other incentive programs. For example, the English Regional Production Bonus, 10% of the programs will be children's and youth projects. And then in terms of selective programs, so for example, in the program for Black and racialized communities, there was additional 5 points in the grid that if you're a children's and youth project, you would get those 5 points. Okay, next slide. And they kind of opened up the flexibility for thresholds. So not just broadcaster license or distributor bands. You could also have a commitment from international broadcaster and streaming platform to contribute up to 25% of the eligible triggering threshold. So that's pretty big. So it basically add them to the threshold. And another incentive was to lower the first threshold in certain first come, first serve programs. Um, and they're the ones that are listed here. Also, contribution, broad development. Yeah, so we wanted to mention that, and can go to questions live.
And just to piggyback on that, one of the other elements with the children's and youth incentives that were introduced this year is that those incentives are also being applied to the broadcaster side of things when an envelope is being calculated. So broadcasters will also benefit from incentives to put more licenses and more envelope towards children's and youth. So the incentive works both to support producers who are working in the children's and youth genre, but it also works to incentivize the broadcasters who are airing and licensing children's and youth content, so that there's an incentive for everybody to do so, and to, shore up the decreasing demand of children's and youth program from the broadcaster, and try and help producers who are working in that genre to access more money and have more incentivized broadcasters. And it bears considering that when you are establishing relationships with broadcasters and you're looking to, ask them for money to help develop or produce your project, that while they have a lot of control and power in this, in being able to decide whether to give you a license for your project or provide some money for your project or to give you some envelope money for your project, it does bear in mind that they do need to spend a certain amount of money every year. They have envelopes that they need to spend every year. They are incentivized to spend them in particular ways, to spend that CMF money that they've been awarded to spend in particular ways. So you don't go to them asking for money without also having some strength in that you are bringing your content, which is, your quality content, to the broadcaster and helping them spend their money. You're not, all that to say is you're not without some strengths when you go and have these conversations with broadcasters. It's in their best interest as well as your own to partner and to work together to create Canadian programming and to access the CMF money. And I think the next slide is us asking if you have any questions.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I've learned a lot through it, and I do have a question for you. So as Regina said, I'm a filmmaker myself. I'm also a director writer, and I love world building, which mean like sci-fi and fantasy. So has CMF ever funded like a sci-fi TV series in Canada?
Absolutely, yeah. And on our CMF website, you can always see the list of funded projects. So if you see any kind of sci-fi show on like CBC, for example, like is Murdoch Mysteries considered sci-fi? But that would be there, yeah.
Yeah, there's the genre distinction for drama is about being scripted. So, but within the scripted genre, there's, all of the genres would be considered. So that's your history, your historical drama, that's sci-fi, that's, all of those sort of subgenres can be captured within that. And we don't make the determination about whether or not sci-fi is preferred over another genre. It's that decision is actually made at the broadcaster level. So if the broadcaster is a broadcaster who regularly airs sci-fi or is looking to increase their portfolio of science fiction programming, and you're coming to them with science fiction programming and they say, we like it, we want to support it, let's get going, then the broadcaster is essentially making the decision that they want to air your sci-fi program. And they're the ones who are making that first decision. And then you would come to us and we don't say, oh, well, no, we're full up of sci-fi or anything like that. We say, great, as long as it's not, doesn't have content that's problematic in certain ways, which we could all, there's sort of the CAB criminal code and there's those sorts of things that are be considered. And, we look at sort of the Canadianness of it, but it can be generic. It can be somewhere out in space. Space isn't Canadian. Space is, universal. There are certain criteria around targeting for Canadian programming, et cetera, that we do look at, but we don't say, no, we don't like sci-fi this year, we're going to go with something else. It's actually the broadcaster who says, yeah, we want your sci-fi, we like it. So if it's popular out in the world and you're writing something that they like, then the broadcasters could be the ones who say, yeah, we're into it.
Perfect. And I guess this question will pertain to like all filmmakers out there especially who are starting out, like either from like the festival world or making like their first series. So my question is, so if it is like your first series project ever and you've never worked with a broadcaster or a CMF funding before, how do you like get a foot in that industry and then like contact the broadcaster and getting like the trigger from them, right? Like that's the first thing we need to do, right? So how do we and what do we need to prepare, and how do we in touch with them and reach them?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first step is attending sessions like these. Like, I'm sure we're one of many other funders that you're going to outreach sessions to. Go to festivals. Broadcasters and funders show up there as well. Make connections. A lot of people don't make films on their own, right? So you make it as a team, and then you can get in that way as well. Yeah, I mean, festival, getting your film into a festival, of course, if you make it yourself, is always a great foot in the door to get your name out there.
I imagine that there's small festivals for shorts or school programs where they bring in industry professionals and try and make those connections. It used to be called the $1,000 cup of coffee, especially out here in the West, where you would fly to Toronto or Montreal and have the $1,000 cup of coffee in order to start establishing relationships. With the sort of advent and the increase of the industry working online, that's sort of democratized a little bit of the platform. You can start, building those relationships online through Zoom meetings, through other sort of opportunities. Their broadcasters usually have outreach where they will attend festivals or markets, and their websites may also talk about when individuals from the broadcaster are going to be available or attending something. But again, in the West, it can still unfortunately be a little bit like a $1,000 cup of coffee. So you have to kind of find ways to start to establish those relationships. And as Christine said, it is a team effort. So you may have people that you're working closely with on a creative basis who actually do have relationships or who are able to sort of help you make those relationships and combine together. Your resources are greater than what you might have individually. And that can be a way of sort of expanding your network within the industry. So, but it's a tricky when you are starting out to start making those relationships. It's always, be professional, be polite, ask for time and schedule time and respect the time that you're awarded, and just keep pushing on with your content. And if what you're creating has some real merit or has some real interest, then, you keep establishing those handshakes as you can and where you can, and keep bringing your quality content, because that's attractive to the the market. They want professional, courteous, resilient, determined, but they also want really great content. So just keep working towards that.
Yeah. So when you say like the West is trickier, is it because like most of the broadcaster is in Toronto? Is that the
Yeah.
reason?
Yeah, a lot of them are. That's why there's the incentive program for producers outside of Toronto to get additional funding, the English Regional Production Bonus.
So are
But
we,
I mean, TELUS is here, so there is a TELUS broadcaster here. Sorry, I missed the question. Go ahead.
I was like, is Vancouver considered regional?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's 150 kilometers outside of Toronto or Montreal for the English and French regional bonus funds. So, you could be in, I think, Sudbury, Ontario, I think is 150 kilometers outside of Toronto. And if the producer is incorporated in Sudbury, resident in Sudbury, and the project is going to be shot either in Sudbury or in any other area that's 150 kilometers outside of Toronto or Montreal, it would be considered regional. But we are a regional, in terms of broadcaster access, we are that regional definition does still apply. CBC has an office here, but whether or not they license a lot of programming from their Vancouver office is a different question. So anytime you can get an online program market event that is incorporating broadcasters or market professionals, try and attend those, meet the individuals that way. Anytime you can get access to people in person, and a lot of the in-person access is expensive, I get it. Banff is not cheap. A lot of the festivals and events aren't cheap, but things like, for Vancouver, they have a bit of like a trade forum aspect. I think there's Factual West is coming up here in Vancouver, and that's targeting documentary producers, and there will be some market interest there, and there'll also be other experienced producers, and this is something to factor into it. There'll be potentially experienced producers who've gone before, who have been producing for a while, and getting some guidance from them, and sometimes even partnering with them, having somebody who's had the previous experience come on board if you've established a good relationship with them and say, hey, can you executive produce? They may be able to open up doors for you. But the partnership and the collaborative process is something that you definitely want to factor into how you move through the industry, because that can help open doors.
Okay, very cool. So like just one last 1 minute question because we don't have time. So what do we need to prepare? Is it like a TV series Bible, a pitch deck, a visual package? What do you suggest? Or is it just we have to like ask each broadcaster?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Because some broadcasters might give you funding to develop a Bible. They might really like your pitch, and they're like, okay, here's some development money. Go do it. Yeah, go develop it further. Or maybe you're looking for something for production. Then you already have a Bible and all that. So it depends on what you're pitching.
And the broadcaster would have said to you, oh, this is what we want now. This is sort of what we need in order to green light or whatever. And you would come to us with that along with all the other business affairs documentation. And that would form part of your application to us. Just very, very briefly, we do have this opportunity. We call it pre-application consultation. And this is an opportunity for a producer to apply without a full application package, but simply to submit a pre-application. So it can be for like, oh, I have this idea and I want to make sure that it's going to meet the documentary genre. Or I have this documentary that I'm working on and I want to make sure that the financing structure that I'm working on is actually going to work for the CMF. So the pre-application consultation is essentially allows you to not have to have an entire application package, allows you to be able to come in with these questions, sharing what you have, and one of the analysts here will be assigned to look at it. We'll get back to you and we'll give you some feedback. And then you can know, oh, this might work. and my broadcaster and I can start talking about this in terms of this being achievable for the CMF, or I have to tweak some things, or, and you haven't had to put an entire application package together in order to do that. So that's something to take advantage of.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Christine, for such an amazing, very informative panel. I've learned a lot about CMF and Broadcaster and like the TV series Zone, which I'm always very curious about. So thank you so much. And I'm going to close this session by saying, please visit vap.org to watch our virtual program now until November 14, 2025. And this will be geo-blocked to Canada only. And please come to our full day in-person screening and industry events on November 15, 2025, which is this Saturday at Scotiabank Theatre, Vancouver. And I hope we'll see you around and at maybe this weekend at VAF.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
you.
Good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.